With every new generation of cameras, they seem to just get more and more complex, more confusing, and have more gotchas for every feature. Drive modes used to be, or at least they seemed like it, something that was relatively simple and straightforward. However, with modern cameras, well, that's just not the case anymore. What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to another video with some tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5. This time around we're taking a look at various drive modes and the seeming maze of options and limitations that exist around them. Now, as with most of these videos on the EOS R5, much of what I'm going to cover also applies to its sister camera, the EOS R6. However, there are some details that will vary from camera to camera. Fortunately, in this case, the R5 and R6 should perform almost identically. However, I haven't validated any of this on the R6, and there is a chance that I may have missed some subtle details, or there may just be flat-out differences. Finally, when this video was recorded, firmware 1.5 was current for the EOS R5, and it's what was on my camera when I did the testing. While I personally don't expect to see major changes in the drive mode in future firmwares, it is always entirely possible. So with that said, let's get started by looking at how to change the drive mode. There are several ways to change the drive modes, and of course some are easier to get to than others depending on how you're using the camera. These include using the dial function menu, which is the default function for the multifunction button, the quick control menu, where the drive mode is second from the bottom on the left-hand column, and the number 5 info screen, which is, or the old style quick control screen, where you'll find it in the middle of the 4th row between the metering and card selection. However, while many functions also have an entry in the camera's menus, drive mode, interestingly, does not. Now, the R5 has 6 different drive modes, and these are single, continuous high plus, continuous high, continuous low, 10-second self-timer / remote control, and 2-second self-timer / remote control. Some of these, like single shooting, should be pretty self-explanatory, and it's really only the continuous modes where things get complicated. That said, let's walk through all the modes anyway, starting with single. Single release mode does what it says on the tin. When you press the shutter release, a single frame is captured. Moreover, this applies to all shutter modes on the R5, so that's mechanical, electronic first curtain, and fully electronic. Additionally, when in single release mode, the camera will release the shutter basically as fast as you can press the shutter button. Obviously, now there is an upper limit to how fast that can actually be, so don't think you can cheat continuous high or continuous high plus by hyper tapping the shutter release in single mode. But for most of us with normal reflexes, you'll basically be able to shoot as fast as you can press the shutter release. Next up are the 2 self-timer modes. These drive modes actually have 2 functions. First, they obviously provide self-timer functionality, either 10 seconds or 2 seconds depending on the selected mode. Unfortunately, there's no way to set custom self-timer on the R5, so if you need that kind of functionality, you'll need to use an external timer controller such as Canon's TC80N3 or an app on your phone connected via Bluetooth. When the shutter release is in the self-timer mode, the camera will flash the self-timer / autofocus assist lamp on the front of the camera as it counts down. For the 10-second timer, it will flash every half second for the first 8 seconds, and then flash rapidly for the last 2 seconds. For the 2-second timer, it just flashes rapidly for the whole 2 seconds. Further, if you have the camera's beep enabled, it will beep in conjunction with the flashing light. If there is one thing that's somewhat frustrating to me about the R5, at least coming from DSLRs like the 5D Mark IV, it's the brightness of the self-timer / AF assist lamp. Okay, sure, it needs to be bright to be useful for the autofocus assist function, which I'm not actually convinced is really all that necessary on the R5. But in self-timer mode, it would be nice if it was dimmer. Anyway, if you started the self-timer and you want to cancel it without taking the picture, you can do that before the shutter releases by pressing the set button on the back of the camera. The second function of these modes is to enable wireless remote control. The R5 and R6 can be triggered remotely with Canon's RC6 infrared remote or their BRE1 Bluetooth remote. but the camera has to be in one of these two drive modes for that to work. When using one of these modes, the camera still performs a self-timer operation. So if you're using the remote as a wireless cable release, you'll probably want to use the shorter self-timer mode. Additionally, remember that while the BRE1 Bluetooth remote can be used from anywhere within 5 meters or 16.4 feet, the RC6 IR remote has to be within line of sight of the IR receiver on the front of the hand grip. As a point of note, if you're using a wired remote release plugged into the remote release terminal on the front of the camera, such as Canon's RS80N3 or TC80N3, you do not need to use one of these drive modes. Remotes that are plugged into the remote release terminal are treated as if they were the physical shutter release on the camera's grip. This also applies if you're using the Canon Connect utility that on your phone to remotely trigger the camera as a Bluetooth or over Bluetooth. It will trigger any shutter modes. You do not have to have the camera in the remote modes. Now, while this video isn't aimed at video shooting or movie shooters, I will mention this anyway. There are self-timer and remote release functions available in movie mode, but they're configured through a menu setting and not the still photography drive mode. To enable remote control in movie mode, you'll need to enable remote control on the Shoot 6 menu, again, when you're in movie mode. And for the self-timer functions, you can find that also on the Shoot 6 menu page under Movie Self-Timer. With the simple modes out of the way, let's move on to the continuous modes. This is also where things get, well, quite a bit more complicated, as various other camera settings and even environmental conditions affect the ability for the camera to reach its maximum shooting speeds. So before I go into the continuous modes individually, let's talk briefly about some of those things that will reduce frame rate. To start with, there's focusing. And by this, I don't just mean the autofocus system in the camera, but the lens's focusing speed and even the contrast and brightness of the subject and scene. Canon cameras support continuous autofocusing in all drive modes and make an effort to ensure subjects are in focus. Sometimes this comes at the expense of frame rate, though. Next are the exposure-related limitations. The most obvious one here is that of shutter speed, and the shutter speed has to be fast enough to support the frame rate in question. For example, the camera just can't shoot 10 frames per second when the shutter speed is set for 1 second long exposure. That said, it's also not as simple as 1/10 of a second shutter speed is fast enough for 10 frames per second either. Remember, there's more to the shooting cycle than just the exposure time, and the actual minimum shutter speeds are quite a bit higher, especially when the mechanical shutter is involved and the camera has to cycle it repeatedly. Additionally, the selected aperture can impact continuous shooting speeds as well, though in my testing, the impact is relatively minor. In short, the further the lens has to stop down, the longer it takes for it to do so, and therefore the bigger the potential impact can be on frame rate. Now, admittedly, the aperture should actuate very quickly, but at the same time, when we're talking about, say, 12 frame per second shooting, every cycle has to be completed in less than 83 milliseconds. Or to put that into perspective, our average reaction time as humans is around 250 milliseconds, or about 3 times slower than the individual frame time at 12 frames per second. Ultimately, when push comes to shove, the camera has to have enough time to stop down the lens, open the shutter, close the shutter, reset the shutter, read out the sensor, focus, and reset everything for the next exposure. Now, of course, some of this stuff can be quite fast, like reading out the sensor, and other things like reading out or resetting the shutter are going to be considerably slower. Fortunately, the R5 has some tricks up its sleeve that help in this respect, like being able to focus while the lens is stopped down. In the same vein as how stopping down the aperture can affect the maximum frame rate, so does the shutter mode. And this goes back to, again, how long it takes for the camera to complete each step in the cycle needed to shoot the next exposure. Using the mechanical, electronic first curtain, or fully electronic shutter dramatically changes how long it takes for the camera to reset that shutter. So in mechanical mode, the camera actually has to run the full cycle twice for every exposure. The shutter has to close to clear the sensor in preparation for the exposure, then open for the actual exposure, then close again to end the exposure, and then open again so metering and focusing can be done before the process can be repeated. In electronic first curtain mode, one of those cycles is completely eliminated as the sensor electronically resets and starts the exposure. Finally, in fully electronic mode, the mechanical shutter never enters the equation. Resetting, clearing, and controlling the sensor all happens at the speed of electronics. Then there are functions like anti-flicker shooting, which dramatically reduce the frame rate in an effort to improve image-to-image consistency. Anti-flicker shooting works essentially by timing your exposures so that they start or cover the same part of the AC electrical cycle that produces flicker and flickering lights. This ensures that the same amount of light is recorded from frame to frame and you don't have flickering exposures. Now, at low frame rates, this usually isn't a problem, as there's plenty of wiggle room to line up with the next available AC cycle. However, at high frame rates, the timing options become much more limited. In general, if you're using anti-flicker mode, expect the shutter release lag to increase, the continuous shooting interval to become irregular, and the frame rate to drop to a maximum of 6.9 frames per second with the electronic first curtain shutter and 4.9 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. Dual pixel RAW imposes even more significant limitations on continuous shooting, as both continuous high and high plus are disabled and only continuous low is available. Another consideration, and one I don't suspect that many photographers have ever thought of a lot, is power draw. Remember, everything on the camera, from the processor to the sensor to the lens's focus motors to the shutter mechanism, are all powered from the camera's battery. The more of these loads that there are running concurrently, the more current or power the battery has to supply, which means the more the battery's voltage can sag in response to that load. This is actually a topic I want to look into in more detail in the future, so you might want to subscribe if you're interested in that kind of thing. This is doubly problematic in the cold, as both battery capacity and its capacity to power higher loads drops dramatically as the temperature goes below 10 degrees C or about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this is battery temperature, not air temperature, so if the batteries are warm, even if it's cold out, you still have pretty good performance. So enough with the vague technical stuff, let's talk about the actual continuous drive modes. When shooting in continuous release on the R5, the system will operate differently depending on whether you're shooting with the electronic shutter or if the mechanical shutter is involved. As a result, for the continuous modes, that's going to be your first consideration. And I'll start with the electronic shutter, as it's the simplest in scope. When the electronic shutter is enabled and the camera is set to any of the continuous release modes, the camera will shoot at a maximum of 20 frames per second. Yep, there's no frame rate limiting capability when the electronic shutter is used. Continuous low gets the same 20 frames per second as continuous high plus does. This was rectified on the EOS R3, and I'd love to see Canon port even fixed but limited frame rates to the R5 and R6, as sometimes you just don't need 20 frames per second, even though you want to use the silent electronic shutter. Of course, the limitations of shooting with the electronic shutter do apply, so you'll be shooting in 12-bit mode, and there can be rolling shutter distortions. Now, if the conditions for the electronic shutter were simple, once you get the mechanical shutter involved, things get considerably more complex. Of the three modes, continuous low is the simplest to understand. On the R5 and R6, continuous low shoots at 3 frames per second whether you're using the mechanical shutter or the electronic first curtain shutter. As an aside, most of the time when I'm out in the field, I'll actually leave my camera in continuous low instead of single shot, even if I'm only just shooting landscapes. At only 3 frames per second, it's easy enough to squeeze off a single frame when that's all I want, but I also get the benefit of being able to use continuous shooting for increased stability if I need it, or just to capture an evolving scene more quickly. Moving up one speed step from continuous low is continuous high. Now, I don't understand why Canon didn't call this continuous medium, as it's now the middle speed of the 3 continuous drive modes, but, whatever. Continuous high increases the maximum frame rate from 3 frames per second to, well, this is where things start getting complicated. Broadly speaking, there are 2 criteria that affect the maximum shooting rate you can expect in continuous high. One is the shutter mode, and the other is the lens, or might be the lens. There actually is a lot of factors, and they're not really clearly documented. Canon has, however, attempted to simplify and indicate the performance that you can expect at the time you're shooting in camera. Though, as usual, it may be not as clear as it could be in the manual what this is all about. So when shooting in either continuous high or continuous high plus, the camera indicates the maximum possible frame rate by the color of and state of the drive icon that you see on the screen. And there are 3 modes or states that this can be in: green, white, and blinking white. When you see a green icon, it indicates that the maximum frame rate possible is available. For continuous high, that's either 8 frames per second when using the electronic first curtain shutter, or 6 frames a second when using the mechanical shutter. When you see a white icon, it indicates that you're in the middle performance range. When using the electronic first curtain shutter, this means frame rates up to 6 frames per second, and with the mechanical shutter, this means 5.1 frames per second. Finally, if the drive mode icon is white and blinking, this indicates that you are in the lowest performance state, and you can expect a maximum of about 4.9 frames per second with the electronic first curtain shutter, or 3.9 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. What triggers each of these conditions isn't entirely clear, and Canon doesn't spell it out in the manual. Your lens, though, is a big factor. All RF lenses and 39 or so of the EF and EF lenses are listed as being compatible with the maximum frame rates in continuous high and continuous high plus drive modes. Well, technically the list in the manual is for 12 frames per second continuous high plus shooting, but for lenses that aren't on this list, I have not seen anything but the lowest shooting speeds, even in continuous high. However, even when using an RF lens, it is possible to see lower states if, for example, you've had to power the camera with an old LPE6 battery instead of a LPE6N or LPE6NH. So the final continuous shooting mode is continuous high plus, and this drive mode delivers the highest possible frame rates out of the camera. But it also comes with the biggest list of restrictions and limitations. So to start with the pros, and then we'll move on to the limitations. As with continuous high, the actual maximum frame rate depends on a number of factors, and the camera will indicate the maximum frame rate you should expect by the color of the drive mode icon. In this case, a green icon indicates that you can shoot up to 12 frames per second, a white icon indicates you can shoot up to 9.2 frames per second, and a blinking white icon indicates that you can shoot up to 6.8 frames a second. Now you'll notice I didn't mention shutter modes there, as switching the camera into continuous high plus drive mode uses the electronic first curtain shutter if you have either the mechanical or electronic first curtain shutter modes selected. Obviously, if you have the electronic shutter selected, you're at 20 frames per second. Additionally, when you're shooting in continuous high plus, the camera reduces the ADC bit depth from 14 bits to 13 bits. Now, as with the 12-bit readout used with the electronic shutter, this does reduce the available dynamic range below ISO 800 somewhat, though the extent of that reduction is actually relatively minor, and it's on the order of about a quarter of a stop at most ISOs and about 6/10 of a stop in the worst case at ISO 100. Okay, now for the caveats. On page 456 of the firmware 1.5 manual, Canon has an intimidating list of conditions for the continuous high plus shooting. And I've seen plenty of people take this and try to argue all kinds of things about how the camera is crap based on something on this list. Now, to me, this list is always read more like the kind of thing you see with a test result that states the conditions in which the tests were made under. And in my own testing, that very much seems to be the case in practice. So Canon says for 12 frame per second shooting to be available, you have to shoot at room temperature of 23 degrees C or 73 degrees Fahrenheit, have a 60% charge or more in your battery or batteries, shoot with a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second or faster, not use the Wi-Fi connection, not have flicker reduction enabled, and use the lens's maximum aperture, and use RF or 12 frames per second compatible EF lenses. So I wanted to know how much of this really applies, at least to the stuff that isn't entirely obvious, like anti-flicker shooting. To start with, the points on temperature, battery charge, weak battery charge performance, and in fact, this also likely applies to the compatible lenses too, to a certain extent. And these are all probably related to power draw and battery performance. Both the charge state and temperature correspond to the maximum performance points for lithium-ion batteries. Moreover, at low temperatures, a lithium-ion battery's ability to deliver both the rated voltages and currents drop. This drop in output increases significantly at temperatures, as I said, below 10 degrees C, and in general, the ideal operating range for lithium-ion batteries is just below about 20 degrees C, which is not far off from the 23 degrees C temperature Canon specifies in the manual. Power concerns are also likely the primary reason behind the R3's lack of such limitations. Even though it shares the same processor, EVF, and probably shutter mechanism based on the rated MTBF and X-Sync speeds, but uses a 10.8 volt 30 watt hour LPE19 battery instead of the smaller 7.2 volt 16 watt hour LPE6 series batteries. Lower voltage, less capacity, less capability to power higher loads. So why the odd comment about the batteries in the BGR10 needing to be above 60%? Well, I think this likely has to do with the way Canon appears to, at least, draw power from the battery grip. From what I can tell, the batteries in the grip aren't just in parallel. Instead, the camera seems to alternate which battery it draws power or the most power from on a shot-by-shot basis. At least that seems to be the case given that it individually tracks shots for both batteries in the grip. So in short, while there are limitations, the listed limitations in the manual are maybe a bit overstated in practice, probably not something to argue about on the internet, and generally just don't get too caught up in the numbers. So with that little detour out of the way, I did want to see how much performance was affected by some of the listed limitations. To that end, I conducted a series of tests, one at the minimum aperture, f22 for my lens, one at 1/100th of a second shutter speed, and one using weak old LPE6 batteries, though they were fully charged. All of these were conducted in manual exposure mode with AF turned on, IS turned off, and using an RF 24-70 f2.8L USM IS USM lens. To conduct these tests, I used my TC80N3 to shoot about 2 seconds worth of images at each of the test settings. I then used EXIF tool and a Python script that I wrote to pull the maker note creation time from each file. In the case of the R5, this timestamp appears to be accurate to within about 10 milliseconds. My baseline test with the aperture wide open, a shutter speed of 1/8000th, yielded 22 frames in 1.7 seconds, or an average frame rate of 12.43 frames per second. Stopping the lens down to f22 yielded 25 frames in 2.02 seconds, or an average frame rate of 12.38 frames per second. Finally, shooting wide open but at a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second yielded 22 frames in 1.95 seconds, or an average frame rate of 11.28 frames per second. Ambient temperature for these tests was around 78 degrees Fahrenheit or 25.5 Celsius. The files reported internal camera temperatures between 25 and 27 degrees Celsius, or about 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Using an old but fully charged LPE6 battery reduced the shooting speed to blinking white levels straight out of the gate. That said, even then the camera managed to shoot 14 frames in 1.92 seconds for an average of 7.29 frames per second, which beats the published 6.8 frames per second. Using a set of fully charged LPE6N batteries resulted in 23 frames in 1.83 seconds, or an average of 12.57 frames per second. So charge state does seem to matter, at least a little bit, as the LPE6NHs I used initially were drawn down to about 70 to 75% or so. Ultimately, or unfortunately, I didn't have or don't have any batteries handy that are discharged to less than 60%, and I'm not going to run batteries down just for the sake of this test. In short, it seems, at least based on my extremely limited testing, that the frame rate does vary with battery type and level, aperture, and shutter speed, which honestly is neither unreasonable or unexpected. The good news, though, is that the frame rate loss due to, say, shooting fully stopped down appears to be minimal at best. At about 0.05 frames per second, it's certainly within the margin of error for my testing. Moreover, while you won't get 12 frames per second with shooting with a 1/100th of a second shutter speed, you do seem to get better than 11 frames per second, which is pretty good, which practically speaking is close enough to not really matter in probably most normal photographic applications. In fact, I suspect that the variation or slowdown due to autofocusing would result in significantly lower shutter speeds than either stopping down or shooting fully stopped down or shooting at 1/100th of a second. Finally, the batteries definitely do matter. When I put old LPE6s in the camera immediately changed the continuous drive icon to blinking white and limited the frame rate to the lowest speed, but then even that was better than advertised. So with all this said, what drive mode you should use is obviously going to be situational. That said, if you're one to shoot at high frame rates, you'll want to use new model batteries, preferably LPE6NHs, though the LPE6Ns also work quite nicely. You'll also want to keep the batteries topped up if you want the highest frame rates possible. So there you go, the not-so-simple world of drive modes on Canon's EOS R5. If you found this useful or informative, let me know by smashing that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, maybe subscribe too. Remember, you can't forget to unsubscribe later if you don't subscribe now. Also, if you know someone else who might find this useful, please share it and spread the word. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.